Good morning, good day to everyone. The 9728th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite a permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Ms. Helen Clark, Member of the Elders. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I would like to remind everyone that this is an official meeting of the UN Security Council, being fully aware that today's briefing is not an easy one. For anyone in the room, I would like to remind all participants and speakers at today's discussion to engage in this meeting with utmost respect and to observe appropriate standards of tone, wording and content in their remarks. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland.
Excellency, Madam President, members of the Security Council, I would like at the outset to express my grave concern over the growing risk of wide-scale regional escalation. The series of explosions across Lebanon and rockets fired towards Israel in recent days adds to the volatility. I call on all sides to refrain from steps that will further exacerbate the situation and take immediate steps to de-escalate. Now, turning to today's briefing that is devoted to the 31st report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. It covers the period from 11 June to 11 September. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect all of its legal obligations in this regard. Settlement activity has continued. In total, some 6,370 housing units were advanced or approved in settlements in the occupied West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. Out of these, 5,840 housing units were in Area C, including 3 outposts legalized under Israeli law, and nearly 530 housing units were advanced in the Gilo settlement in East Jerusalem. Construction tenders were published for approximately 1,100 housing units in settlements, including 780 in East Jerusalem. In settlement-related steps on 18 July, the Israeli Defense Forces Central Command signed a military order amending an order from 1995 that implemented the Oslo Accord, so as to grant the military commander in the area of authority over planning and construction in certain parts of Area B that had been transferred to Palestinian Authority. The civil administration on 25 June declared over 12,700 dunams of state land in Jordan Valley, adjacent to 8,000 dunams declared in March. Demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures continued across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. citing the lack of Israeli-issued building permits, which are almost impossible for Palestinians to obtain. Israeli authorities seized or forced people to demolish 373 structures, displacing more than 550 people, including 250 children. 26 of these structures were donor-funded. Evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem also continued. Following a Supreme Court ruling on 15 August, Israeli security forces evicted the Shehada family from their home in Silvan in favor of a settler organization, displacing 35 Palestinians. 180 Palestinians, including 111 children, left their occupied West Bank communities, citing violence and harassment by settlers and shrinking grazing land. On 19 July 2024, the International Court of Justice rendered the advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Among its findings, the court reaffirmed that the Israeli settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the regime associated with them have been established and are being maintained in violation of international law, and, among other things, concluded that it was of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. It further stated that the State of Israel continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, that the State of Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, that all states are under an obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from such unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including all acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation and destruction. Unfortunately, the devastating conflict in Gaza has continued alongside daily violence in the occupied West Bank, with a high number of fatalities incidences, precluding me from detailing it all. In Gaza, according to Gaza Ministry of Health, from 11 June to 11 September, at least 3,920 Palestinians were killed and at least 10,200 were injured. This brings total reported numbers by the MOH in Gaza since 7 October to more than 41,000 Palestinians killed, a majority of whom are reportedly women and children. According to Israeli sources, 101 hostages are still being held captive of the 251 hostages abducted on 7 October. On 1st of September, the IDF discovered 6 hostages in Gaza killed by Palestinian armed groups, including 2 women, and in a separate operation recovered the bodies of 12 other killed hostages and rescued 1 hostage alive. Israeli sources also reported over 1,580 Israelis and foreign nationals killed by Hamas or by other Palestinian armed groups, including at least 338 women and 40 children, and 783 members of the security forces since 7 October in attacks, either in or originating from Gaza. Israel continued to conduct strikes from air, land, and sea, resulting in tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties, massive displacement of civilians, and widespread destructions, including civilian infrastructure. Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to hold hostages in horrific conditions, with reports of severe maltreatment, launched attacks at Israel forces, and fired rockets and other projectiles indiscriminately towards Israel, Israel stated that Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to place fighters and military equipment among and underneath dense concentrated areas with civilians. Israeli operations continue throughout Gaza, displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. 89% of Gaza has been placed under evacuation orders at one point or another since 7 October. New evacuation orders have reduced the size of the Israeli designated humanitarian zones at Al-Mabasi to just 11% of the size of the Strip. Repeated attacks on 30 schools and airstrikes in densely populated areas continued, resulting in the death of internally displaced people sheltering in those locations. On 11 September, 3 IDF airstrikes on IDP tents in Al-Muassi and Khan Yunis killed at least 19 people and injured at least 60 others. The next day, 2 IDF airstrikes hit Al-Jaouni school sheltering IDPs in Nusrat, killing at least 18 people, including children, women, and 6 UNRWA staff. UNRWA said it was the deadliest incident in the agency's history. The IDF stated that the target in each strike was a Hamas command and control center. On 13 July, according to Gaza Ministry of Health, at least 91 Palestinians were killed and over 300 injured in an IDF airstrike on Al-Mabasi, which, according to the Israeli government, killed the commander of Hamas Al-Qassam brigades, Mohammed Deif. On 10 August, an IDF airstrike on the Al-Tabin school in Gaza City, sheltering approximately 6,000 IDPs, killed at least 93 Palestinians and wounded dozen others, according to Gaza Ministry of Health. The IDF said that 31 militants were killed in this attack. On 27 August, despite being clearly marked, a World Food Programme team was struck by gunfire on its moving towards IDF checkpoints, sustaining 10 bullet shots. On 9 September, the IDF shot at the UN convoy supporting polio vaccination for children in northern Gaza, causing heavy damage to UN vehicles, and held the convoy at gunpoint for 8 hours, threatening to arrest 12 UN staff. In the reporting period, at least 27 UN personnel were killed in Gaza, bringing the total number of UN staff killed since 7 October to 224. Meanwhile, violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continued at alarming levels. 160 Palestinians, including 4 women and 28 children, were killed during ISF airstrikes, search and arrest operations, armed exchanges, demonstrations, and other incidences. 1 Palestinian was killed by Israeli settlers. A total of 849 Palestinians were injured, including 147 by tear gas inhalation and 370 by live ammunition. A total of 86 Palestinians, including 9 children and 3 women, were killed by airstrikes. In August, Israeli airstrikes in the occupied West Bank killed at least 1 Palestinian every day on average. Since 7 October, 185 Palestinians, including 33 children, have been killed in airstrikes in the West Bank, as reported by ISF. That underlines that it's hitting military targets. According to Israeli sources, 14 Israelis, including 2 women and 9 security force personnel, were killed, and another 67 were injured by Palestinians in shooting, stabbing, and ramming attacks and other incidences. ISF carried out 1,673 search and arrest operations in the occupied West Bank, resulting in 1,295 Palestinians detained, including at least 57 children. The special representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict expressed her deep concern about the recently published reports by the UN describing a dramatic deterioration in conditions of detention for Palestinian men, women, and children under Israeli custody since 7 October attacks. These reports of sexual violence and other inhumane and degrading treatment could amount to sexualized torture perpetrated against Palestinian men and women. In July, Israeli military police arrested several Israeli reserve soldiers suspected of the serious sexual abuse of a Palestinian detainee. In occupied West Bank, most Palestinians were killed in the context of ISF operations in Area A, including during the exchanges of fire with armed Palestinians. These situations are characterized by increased use of airstrikes, IEDs, and destruction of both private property and civilian infrastructure. From 5 to 6 August, the IDF conducted a majority operation in Jenin, killing at least 6 Palestinians and in 2 airstrikes and with live ammunition, and injured another 7 in armed clashes. From 28 August to 6 September, the IDF conducted its largest operation in the occupied West Bank since 2002, stating that it was targeting Hamas and PIJ members and infrastructure in Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas. The Palestinian Ministry of Health said that 36 Palestinians were killed and dozens wounded during the operation, including 8 children. The IDF bulldozed water, sewage, electricity, and communication lines, and approximately 70% of the road network in Jenin city, citing the IED threat to its soldier. 1 IDF soldier was shot and killed during this operation. High levels of settler-related violence continued. On 16 August, scores of armed settlers attacked the Palestinian village of Jit in Qalqilia, shooting and killing 1 Palestinian man, injuring another, and setting fire to Palestinian-owned houses, vehicles, and agricultural land. Israel launched an investigation into the incident. A number of senior Israeli officials condemned the attack. On 26 August, dozens of armed Israeli settlers attacked Wadi Rahal village in Bethlehem, during which a Palestinian man was killed. Violence against Israelis by Palestinians also continued at high level. On 11 August, an Israeli man was killed in a shooting attack in the Jordan Valley, for which Hamas claimed responsibility. On 18 August, a Palestinian killed a guard in the Israeli settlement of Kedumim. The following day, Hamas and Palestinian PIJ claimed to have conducted what appeared to be an attempt of suicide bombing in Tel Aviv, which led to the death of the attacker and the injury of 1 civilian. Madam President, the Security Council in its resolution called upon both parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. Unfortunately, such acts continued. A joint statement from Hamas and PIJ threatened a return to the use of suicide bombings, a call echoed in a speech by a senior Hamas official, while Hamas Al-Qassam Brigade published a graphic leaflet showing an explosive belt and a bombed Israeli bus. In a video posted on social media, an Israeli minister said Palestinian prisoners must be killed, shot in the head, while urging the passing of the bill by the Knesset allowing capital punishment for terrorist offenses. Another minister said of Palestinians in Gaza, nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral, until our hostages are returned. 2 Israeli ministers made visits to the holy sites in Jerusalem, with one of the ministers calling the site Israeli sovereign territory, while speaking of policies to change the status quo. The Israeli office of the prime minister stated that there was no change to the status quo. Madam President, Resolution 2334 reiterated calls by the Middle East Quartet for affirmative steps to be taken immediately to reverse negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the 2-state solution. The catastrophic public health conditions in Gaza continued to deteriorate as access to safe drinking water and sanitation facilities continued to shrink. Severe shortages of fuel and medical supplies continue to limit the functionality of remaining hospitals and healthcare centers, particularly in the northern part of Gaza. Education continued to suffer, with Gaza's 600,000 children having missed an entire year of school and evacuation orders forcing over 30 temporary education centers to close. Despite of these setbacks, UNRWA expanded learning activities. In August, the Palestinian Ministry of Health confirmed the first case of polio in 25 years. A polio vaccination campaign was launched on 31st of August by WHO and UNICEF, with support from other agencies, including UNRWA, which has thus far vaccinated 70% of some 650,000 children under 10. Following the Israeli military ground operations into Rafah and the subsequent closure of the Rafah crossing in May, humanitarian organizations faced many obstacles that impeded their ability to regularly pick up supplies entering through Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salem. These included continued hostilities, impassable roads, and deteriorating civil order. On 6 August, the Israeli Minister of Finance said Israel will confiscate $26 million of Palestinian clearance revenues that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority and transfer it to families of terror victims. The next day, Israel terminated a customs clearing mechanism with Norway that reportedly holds nearly $220 million of Palestinian clearance revenues in the scroll of demanded funds to be returned to Israel. Israel describes this as a response to Norway's recognition of the state of Palestine in May. In Israel, some 120,000 Israelis, including 50,000 children, have been displaced from their homes in the south or north of Israel in the context of the hostilities. Madam President, in Resolution 2334, the Security Council also called upon all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territory occupied since 1967. No new steps are known to have been taken in this period. In its advisory opinion on 19 July 2024, the International Court of Justice expressed the view that the member states are under the obligation to distinguish in their dealings with Israel between territory of the State of Israel and the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Resolution 2334 also called upon all parties to continue inter alia to exert collective efforts to launch credible negotiations on all final status issues in the Middle East peace process. Intense negotiations between international mediators and the parties continued in Doha and Cairo to formulate a deal for a ceasefire and the release of hostages in Gaza. On 27 June, Canada announced that it has imposed new sanctions on 7 individuals and 5 entities for the role in facilitating, supporting, or financially contributing to acts of violence by Israeli extremist settlers against Palestinian civilians and their property. The US and European Union also announced another round of sanctions and restrictive measures against settlers and its entities. On 13 July, Argentina designated Hamas a terrorist organization and ordered a freeze on its financial assets. From 21 to 23 July, 14 Palestinian factions, including Fatah and Hamas, attended reconciliation talks in Beijing, where they signed a declaration reiterating their commitment to form a national unity government and implement previous agreements. Madam President, in closing, allow me to share the Secretary General's observations on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. I once again strongly condemn the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on Israel on 7 October 2023, their continued holding of hostages in Gaza, and the recent deliberate killing of 6 hostages whose bodies showed signs of severe mistreatment. There is no justification for the deliberate killings, maiming, torture, and abductions of civilians and the use of sexual violence. Hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and for as long as they are held, they must be treated humanely and allowed to receive visits and assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. I condemn the continued indiscriminate attacks, including the firing of rockets towards Israeli population centers and the use of human shields, which are prohibited by international humanitarian law and must cease. I again unequivocally condemn the widespread killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including women and children, and the deprivation of essentials to survive. Nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. I'm concerned over what may amount to a serious violation of international humanitarian law, including possible non-compliance with the principle of distinctions, proportionality, and precautions. I mourn the UN staff killed in Gaza and strongly condemn the killing of all health and humanitarian personnel. These incidents must stop immediately and be thoroughly and independently investigated. The level of suffering witnessed in Gaza is unprecedented in my mandate as Secretary General of the United Nations. To address the colossal humanitarian needs and improve the intolerable conditions of civilians, Israel must fully open all crossings into Gaza and facilitate the immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale directly to the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip in accordance with its obligation under international humanitarian law. I reiterate my call for an immediate ceasefire to end humanitarian suffering, urging all sides to redouble efforts to reach a deal that will bring about an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. I continue to engage all stakeholders towards these objectives. A deal is crucial to saving lives, releasing all the hostages, reducing regional tension, and enabling the UN, in cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, to accelerate efforts to address the pressing needs of the Gaza population. I welcome the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and United States to reach a deal. I strongly condemn all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror. The escalation of violence in the occupied West Bank and Israel is highly alarming. Palestinian refugee camps are sustaining significant infrastructure damage during ISF operations throughout the occupied West Bank. I urge the security forces to exercise maximum restraints and to use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. I call on the Israelis to abide by its obligations under international law. All those injured must have access to medical care, and humanitarian workers must be able to reach everyone in need. I also recall that Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility to ensure that the civilian population is protected against all acts of violence, and call on Israel to ensure thorough, independent, and prompt investigation of all instances of possible excessive use of force. I am deeply concerned about the large number of Palestinians, including children, detained by Israeli security forces, and the increase in the number of Palestinians held in administrative detention by Israel since 7 October 2023. Reports of torture and other ill treatment during arrest and detention, including sexual violence, are also deeply concerning. I condemn the attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including in the proximity and with the complicity of Israeli security forces. The attack on Jit was illustrative of the increasingly coordinated and deadly nature of these attacks. Attacks by Palestinians against Israel must also cease immediately. I condemn Hamas' attempted attack in Tel Aviv, and I'm alarmed by its call to return to the use of suicide bombings. All necessary steps must be taken to hold perpetrators accountable. I reiterate the utmost need to uphold the status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem, taking into account the special and historic role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy sites. I remain deeply troubled by the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israeli policies and practices are systematically altering the land in the occupied Palestinian territory, creating dangerous dynamics to an existential threat to the two-state solution. Settlement expansions, settler violence, and recent Israeli administrative steps and large-scale state land declarations in the occupied West Bank are fundamentally changing the landscape and deepening the occupation. I reiterate that the establishment of Israeli settlement in Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. In this respect, I note the recent findings of the International Court of Justice mentioned above in its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures may entail numerous humanitarian rights violations and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. I note the conclusion of the International Court of Justice in this regard. I urge the government of Israel to end these practices in line with its obligation under international law. Palestinians must be allowed to build legally and address their development needs. I am alarmed by the multiple instances in which officials have engaged in dangerous provocations, incitements, and inflammatory language, which must be rejected by all. I express my deepest appreciation to UNRWA and all the UN agencies and personnel and humanitarian aid workers who remain committed to their work across the OPT despite the significant security risk. I'm deeply concerned by efforts to undermine their life-saving works. The inviolability of UN premises must be respected at all times by all. To meet the challenges ahead, we must establish political and security frameworks that can address the humanitarian catastrophe, start early recovery, rebuild Gaza, and lay the ground for a political process to end the occupation and establish a two-state solution. These frameworks must facilitate a legitimate Palestinian government that can unify Gaza and the occupied West Bank politically, economically, and administratively, while reversing the steady deterioration dynamics in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian unity is an essential building block to just and lasting peace. Israeli measures that undermine the PA must be urgently addressed. The government of Palestine will require significant support from the international community to advance these objectives. Finally, any lasting progress cannot be divorced from the ongoing Israeli occupation and unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Progress towards peace must address and fully realize the fundamental and legitimate right of Palestinians to self-determination and sovereignty over the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory. It must also address Israel's legitimate security concern. We must collectively take steps towards establishing a political framework that outlines tangible, irreversible steps towards ending the occupation and establishing a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security on the basis of UN resolutions, previous agreements, and international law, with Jerusalem as capital of both states. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts towards that goal. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Wennesland for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Helen Clark.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council, it is an honour to speak to you today as a member of the Elders. Resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a priority for our group since its founding by Nelson Mandela in 2007. The implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2334 is acutely relevant to the current devastating phase of the conflict and to any chance of securing a fair and durable two-state solution in line with international law. But its failure so far also poses an existential question. Can the Security Council enforce its own resolutions? This is surely crucial to its credibility. The Elders unequivocally condemn the 7 October terrorist attacks and the holding of hostages by Hamas, which have caused deep trauma for the Israeli people. We also unequivocally condemn Israel's disproportionate military response, including its bombardment, siege, and blockade of Gaza. This amounts to collective punishment and is causing great suffering and trauma to the Palestinian people. The Security Council has a responsibility to chart a path towards a sustainable peace. A full, immediate and complete ceasefire in Gaza is an indispensable step. It is deeply disturbing that Security Council Resolution 2735 calling for this remains unimplemented. It is clear that unless and until the root causes of the conflict are addressed, violence will persist and escalate. The conflict management approach pursued by powerful members of the international community has failed. A new approach is needed, grounded in international law, including the enforcement of this Council's resolutions. Council members who question the binding status of these resolutions or who use their veto to protect an ally or to oppose a geopolitical rival are eroding the Council's authority. They also undermine their own reputations and long-term interests. All member states are also bound to respect and comply with decisions of the International Court of Justice. This includes the provisional measures ordered to protect Palestinians in Gaza. The ICJ's recent advisory opinion, while non-binding, is an authoritative landmark ruling. It concludes that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestine territory is unlawful and must end as rapidly as possible. This obligation does not depend on achieving a successful outcome to peace negotiations. The General Assembly and Security Council should give effect to the advisory opinion by passing resolutions endorsing it and setting out what action is required by Israel, other member states and the UN to bring an end to the occupation. The Elders welcome the passing of the General Assembly resolution on this issue yesterday. How will the Security Council respond to the advisory opinion? Security Council Resolution 2334 reaffirmed the illegality of the settlements. Yet settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem continues to accelerate, while attention is focused on Gaza. More decisive member state action is needed. All member states must distinguish between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory in all forms of cooperation and cease any assistance to or trade with illegal settlements. Targeted measures should be applied against state and non-state entities and individuals responsible for maintaining and expanding illegal settlements. Steps have already been taken, including by the United States and the European Union, to sanction settlers for attacks on Palestinian civilians. But sanctions should also target financial flows to entities which are funding and constructing illegal settlements, and those in the government of Israel who are pursuing annexation. This Council must respect the process of criminal accountability through the International Criminal Court, including the ICC prosecutor's request for arrest warrants in response to alleged atrocity crimes by Hamas and the government of Israel. Member states seeking to undermine the ICC are damaging the international rule of law. They are undermining accountability in other contexts, including in the context of Russia's illegal war on Ukraine. This must stop. There will be no security for Israelis or Palestinians if the war in Gaza is followed by a continuation of unlawful occupation and annexation. But without a decisive change of direction, this seems likely. The Elders propose a set of guiding principles to underpin a pathway towards sustainable peace, based on self-determination, sovereignty, and mutual security for both peoples. First, full UN membership and recognition of the State of Palestine should be supported by all Council members and other states now. Statehood is not dependent on peace negotiations. Strengthening the Palestinian Authority remains crucial, but statehood should not have to wait for governance reforms. Second, normalisation of relations between Israel and Arab states is essential for Israel's long-term security and for regional stability and prosperity. But full normalisation must be conditional on Israel ending the occupation permanently and supporting the implementation of a two-state solution. Third, the security of Palestinians and Israelis must be given equal weighting. There can be no sovereign state of Palestine with continued Israeli security control over the Palestinian people. Israel's security concerns do not justify unlawful occupation or annexation. Fourth and final, the goal of a single unified government overseeing Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem should be supported by all Palestinian factions, including Hamas, and by the entire international community. Sustainable peace will require reconciliation under the umbrella of a revitalised Palestine Liberation Organisation based on adherence to international law. Violence against civilians by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups must end. All of this requires bold, principled leadership and the political will to break with the failed policies of the past. All forms of leverage should be applied, including the suspension of arms transfers in response to continued violations of international law. Only by implementing international legal obligations, ensuring accountability, and ending impunity can a path to end this conflict be created once and for all. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Clark for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia. Excellencies, in March I hosted in our capital representatives of two organizations, Women Wage Peace and Women of the Sun. Together they led the Mothers' School. They are Palestinian and Israeli mothers determined to stop the cycle of violence and change the reality of the conflict between the two nations for the benefit of their children and for generations to come. And I was very much inspired by what they described as resistance in hope. We are at a precipice. Almost a year into the war, the devastation and immense suffering of civilians continues relentlessly. Hostages have not returned home. Civilians in Gaza continue to endure unprecedented levels of violation and destruction. The potential to engulf the region in a wider conflict remains at all-time highs. The latest escalation in Lebanon is another sign of it. Despite that, I, just as the mothers I spoke with, continue to embrace hope. Hope that peace returns to Gaza and the West Bank. Colleagues, firstly, we need compliance with international law. Since day one of this conflict, we have called for the compliance with international law. Instead, serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law persist, challenging the very notion of the international law framework which we collectively establish to safeguard all people and to protect the most vulnerable in particular. On top of that, resolutions of the Security Council and provisional orders of the International Court of Justice are being blatantly disregarded. Such violations weaken the credibility of our institutions and erode global trust. In the shadow of the appalling situation in Gaza, settlement policy and expansion has accelerated at unprecedented levels. Settler violence is on the rise, and the situation in the West Bank is boiling. The status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem is being repeatedly violated. Negative trends must be met with positive and concrete steps. I therefore warmly welcome the adoption of the General Assembly resolution following the ICJ advisory opinion, providing tangible steps towards a blueprint for peace. And it is now time for the Council to follow suit. Secondly, we need respect. More respect for the prevailing sentiment of the wider UN membership, which demands a ceasefire and a just and lasting peace. We need more respect for the UN system, including UNRWA, and more compliance with its charter. This is the best prospect for alleviating the unimaginable suffering. We need a more respectful and action-oriented dialogue in this chamber, one that prioritizes peace over partnership. We also need respect and dialogue between people in the region. This starts first and foremost with leadership for peace on both sides. Leadership cannot be based on incitement, hatred, provocation, or terrorism. It equally cannot endorse such actions, and it must be respectful of other opinions, especially of civil society. Thirdly, we need courage. Courage to uphold our communities to the two-state solution, which remains the only path to durable peace. I say this as a foreign minister of a country who has taken a clear stance for peace in the conflict. We have decided to be active in this Council and to deliver on what we promised during our campaign, building trust and securing the future. We therefore took the decision to vote for membership of the State of Palestine in the United Nations. We also recognized the State of Palestine. I urge others to take similar steps. Universal recognition of Palestine and its admission as a full UN member is an essential element in our shared agenda for peace. The future of peace in the region will slip away without tangible steps. It is the job of this Council as a whole and of its individual members to act as guarantors for peace with courage. Clearly, we need also courageous leaders in the region, leaders willing to set aside their individual interests, leaders who dare to dream of a different region, turning a new page in this decades-long conflict, leaders who dare to envision a different future, one where normalization of relations is possible and militarization gives way to cooperation. And lastly, we need diplomacy. We need diplomacy to succeed in delivering a ceasefire. There must be hard work of diplomacy bilaterally, but also hard work of diplomacy multilaterally. Past peace processes have not yielded the results we want to see. We therefore believe an inclusive, meaningful, and time-bound peace process coupled with reconstruction should take place. We want to see the UN playing a central role in that, and a Palestinian government strong enough to shoulder its responsibilities. I welcome the day after plan presented by the Palestinian Prime Minister. But diplomacy must be more than words. It requires concerted action. We call for the swift convening of an international peace conference, as agreed in Madrid, to advance the two-state solution. Colleagues, I imagine a mother in Gaza beaming with joy as her child can study again. I imagine a mother in Tel Aviv not needing to teach her child how to use a shelter. I imagine a mother in Jenin not worrying whether her child will be detained. This is the future I dream of, a future where peace is not just a possibility, but a reality. The first step towards this reality is an immediate ceasefire. This Council is the most powerful body for peace and security in the world. I always defended that the strongest and most suitable and sustainable tool in diplomacy is dialogue. However, dialogue cannot entail only words. It must include listening and understanding. But in this chamber, dialogue must lead to meaningful action. If not, this Council must also turn a new page in the tools that is ready to use. Thank you. I resume now my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Coordinator Wennesland and Ms. Clark, for your briefings. Colleagues, this is a decisive moment for the parties to the ongoing conflict and for the security of the broader region. The Council will have an opportunity to further discuss the situation with regard to Lebanon tomorrow afternoon. The United States continues to gather facts, and we reiterate that it is not in any party's interest for there to be a broader regional conflict. Indeed, Secretary Blinken continues to work for an immediate ceasefire and hostage release deal consistent with Resolution 2735. As he emphasized yesterday during his visit to Egypt, we all know the ceasefire deal is the best chance to tackle the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to address regional stability. It is imperative all parties refrain from actions which could escalate broader regional tensions and undermine the ongoing negotiations. We have also called on all parties to the fighting in Gaza to avoid putting civilians at risk and to take important steps to ensure that the humanitarian personnel are able to do their jobs and help save lives. There is no clearer evidence of Hamas's total indifference to Palestinian civilians in Gaza than its continued hiding under civilian sites. For the sake of civilians on all sides of the conflict, this must stop. We must not grow numb to the human suffering in the region. Again, it is manifestly in the interest of Israelis, Palestinians, and every country in the region for the fighting in Gaza to stop and a broader conflict to be averted. As we have emphasized before, a ceasefire in Gaza could reduce tensions along the Blue Line, creating conditions for displaced Lebanese civilians to go home in the south and for Israeli civilians displaced by Hezbollah's persistent rocket attacks since October 7 to return to their homes. Colleagues, as we heard today, the situation in the West Bank also remains of grave concern. We condemn deadly violence against Palestinian civilians by extremist settlers in the West Bank. Moreover, we reiterate Israel would be well advised to avoid military operations and other measures that risk further inflaming tensions and destabilizing the already combustible situation. Israel's program of support for the expansion of settlements is inconsistent with international law and only serves to weaken Israel's security by inflaming tensions and undercutting efforts to achieve a two-state solution. Colleagues, the Security Council can and should play a constructive role consistent with the principles outlined by President Biden in May and that this Council endorsed in Resolution 2735 to encourage Hamas to accept the deal on the table, to encourage a de-escalation of regional tensions, and to reaffirm to all parties that unilateral measures, such as settlements and one-sided resolutions in New York, will not bring about a two-state solution. Implementing Resolution 2735 will also require political will from leaders in the region. There is no alternative to a negotiated end to the fighting in Gaza, and there is no alternative path to achieve a two-state solution other than through direct negotiations between the parties. The United States will continue to do everything possible to put forward ideas and proposals to achieve a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza that would help lay the foundation for a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Colleagues, we see the paths before us. One path would save lives, bring relief to the people of Gaza, bring the hostages home, and de-escalate regional tensions. The other, darker path, which we should all endeavor to avoid going any further down, is marked by further impasses in ceasefire talks, civilian suffering in Gaza, and the risk of additional unilateral actions that could set off a broader conflict. Hamas wants the region to go down the second path, for the fighting and suffering in Gaza to continue, for there to be a broader regional conflict. It is therefore on the shoulders of anyone who wants to see this war end and cares about the plight of Palestinian civilians to press Hamas to engage constructively and close the deal on the table. That is the best way to ensure that the war ends and the region does not go down a darker path in the coming weeks. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of United States, and then I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for the Secretary General's oral report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. I also thank Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark for her valuable insights. Madam President, the report by the Special Coordinator has once again confirmed Israel's obstinate stance on settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in violation of Security Council Resolution 2334. Israel continues to dig in its heels on its colonial settler policy. This is despite the clear provisions of the resolution that the establishment by Israel of settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation on the international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. The extent of Israel's ongoing settlement activities is reflected in the fact that demolition of homes and civilian infrastructure this year have reached the highest number in 2 decades, with greater fatalities owing to more brutal tactics used in the demolition exercise. The recent advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice also definitively established Israel's obligation to end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, to cease immediately all new settlement activities, and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. The General Assembly resolution adopted yesterday laid out the next steps following the issuance of the advisory opinion, and we call on Israel and all member states to fulfill their obligations as set out in that resolution. Madam President, we have taken note that since our last briefing on Resolution 2334, the situation in the occupied West Bank has worsened considerably, with several airstrikes on civilian infrastructure and a recent large-scale military operation which left many Palestinians displaced, their homes destroyed, and their property taken over by Israeli settlers. We note, for example, according to OCHA, since 7th of October 2023, 1,628 Palestinians have been displaced in incidents involving Israeli settlers. All of this is enabled by the Israeli legal system that systematically awards Palestinian lands to colonial settlers, thereby empowering its security officials to protect those who act based on these decisions. We have been talking about this issue for so long that the danger of becoming rote in our response to this illegality is very real. We must never become numb to these violations of international law, because we risk normalizing Israeli settlement policies and practices. Let us not forget what these policies and practices translate to for thousands of Palestinians who pay even the high price of death for resisting the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. Madam President, the danger of Israeli settler policy lies in the fact that it is intended to alter the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, in furtherance of the one-state solution which it unabashedly advocates and pursues. This is in clear violation of international humanitarian law and relevant resolutions both of this Council and the General Assembly. Guyana therefore condemns in the strongest terms Israel's continuing disregard for the decisions of this Council and of international law more generally. The two-state solution remains the only viable pathway to bring about an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Council must therefore respond to Israel's actions, which are steadily eroding the two-state solution and entrenching a one-state reality. We must not countenance the illegalities that are born from such a plan. Madam President, all members have a responsibility, pursuant to 2334, to make it consequential for Israel to continue its settlement expansion. A few visa restrictions when there are more than 700,000 illegal settlers can hardly be expected to have any real impact. Visa restrictions for anyone living in settlements set up in areas outside of the pre-1967 borders may have a much greater impact. Refusing to have commercial engagement with any individual, group, or entity living in, operating in, or maintaining interests in settlements that violate the pre-1967 borders will definitely have a real impact. Collectively and individually, member states must consider such decisions to stem this tide of illegality and disregard for the resolutions and decisions on the question of Israel's illegal settlements in the Palestinian occupied territories. Let me conclude by once again emphasizing the urgency of redoubling efforts to achieve the two-state solution. This must be in tandem with the obligation created by the General Assembly for Israel to vacate all Palestinian territory which it now occupies. We also call again for an immediate ceasefire and the return of all hostages held in Gaza and Palestinians detained illegally in Israel. Madam President, the unresolved conflict between Israel and Palestine continues to hinder peace and security in the Middle East region, and we appeal to all member states to act urgently and genuinely to bring this conflict to a permanent, peaceful, and just end. Guyana is prepared to do its part. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to also thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and Ms. Helen for their briefing. Madam President, we are sadly moving toward the first anniversary of the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th and the subsequent military operations by Israel, resulting in the unfathomable humanitarian suffering in Gaza. The Republic of Korea reiterates its call once again on both parties to faithfully engage in the negotiations for the deal detailed in the Resolution 2735. An immediate ceasefire and release of hostages, combined with a surge in humanitarian aid throughout Gaza, will and should lay the first ground to pave a path of peaceful coexistence between Israel and Palestine. As repeatedly stressed by my delegation, it is a legal obligation of the parties including Israel, to protect the civilian and humanitarian workers at all times. In this connection, we are deeply concerned that Israel has now targeted our Yaouné school in Nusayra camp 5 times since last October. The targeted facility was sheltering 12,000 displaced people. We believe that Israel can do more to satisfy its obligations under international humanitarian law. At the same time, Hamas must stop endangering civilians by using civilian infrastructures for military purposes. For almost a year, the focus in this Council has been the dire situation in Gaza. However, it is clear that we should not forget the ongoing instability and exacerbating violence in another part of the Palestine, the West Bank. We are witnessing with grave apprehension escalating violence by multiple actors in the West Bank, including the Israel security forces, Palestinian militant groups, and extreme settlers. In addition, we are appalled that more than 600 Palestinians, including 158 children, as well as 18 Israelis, have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. We call for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians in accordance with Resolution 2334. We are particularly concerned by the killing of UNRWA staff members last Friday, which marked the first UNRWA employee to be killed in the West Bank in more than a decade. We are also deeply troubled by the killing of an American-Turkish activist in the West Bank earlier this month. We call for a thorough investigation as well as accountability for any wrongdoings. At the same time, we remain deeply dismayed by ongoing land seizures, home demolitions, and illegal outpost construction to the West Bank, being carried out with impunity by both extreme settlers and Israel security forces. We are also shocked by ongoing vandalism by settlers, often alongside the military against Palestinian families and their properties. It is urgent for Israel to fundamentally change its policy against Palestinians. Resolution 2334 was adopted long before the current conflict in Gaza started. Yet this 8-year-old resolution details all the agreed upon guiding principles that we should keep in mind as we strive to resolve the Palestinian questions. As provided in the resolution, the establishment of Israeli settlements constitutes a flagrant violation under international law. We urge Israel to stop any measures that amount to annexation of the occupied Palestinian territory, including expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Madam President, I would like to conclude my statement by reiterating one important element in Resolution 2334 that we should not forget: a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East through negotiations between parties based on the principle of land for peace. We believe that any action in the United Nations, both in the Council and in General Assembly, meant to resolve the decades-long conflict between Israel and Palestine, should be firmly based on the negotiated peace process reflected in Resolution 2334. We believe a negotiated solution is still possible once a ceasefire is in place. We call on Israel and Palestine, represented by a reformed and strengthened Palestinian Authority, to directly engage in talks that will resume the long overdue aspirations based on the vision of the two-state solutions, which will in turn lead to a durable peace and stability in the whole region. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
je remercie
I
M.
wish
Wennesland et
to
Madame
thank
Clark
Mr.
pour
Wennesland and Madam
leurs
Clark
exposés.
for their briefings.
Le Conseil de
The
sécurité
Security
doit
Council must
réagir
react
face à
in the
l'accélération
light
de la
of the
colonisation en
acceleration of
Cisjordanie
settlement
et à
activities in
Jérusalem
the West Bank
Est.
and in
La
East
position de la
Jerusalem.
France est constante. La
France's
colonisation
position
est
remains
contraire au droit
steadfast.
international.
Settlement
Nous la
activities runs
condamnons.
counter to international
La
law,
France ne
and we
reconnaîtra
condemn
jamais
it.
l'annexion
France will
illégale
never
des
recognize the
territoires
illegal
ni la
annexation of
légalisation de
territory,
colonies
nor
sauvages.
the
Elle a
legalization
condamné
of
les attaques
illegal
israéliennes
settlements.
contre
We
des écoles
condemned the
dans la
Israeli
bande
attacks
de Gaza.
against schools
La
in the
France a
Gaza
aussi
Strip.
condamné les attaques
France
récurrentes
also
de colons
condemned
violents
the recurrent
contre des
attacks
écoles en
perpetrated by violent
Cisjordanie
settlers
et elle appelle Israël
against
à
schools in the
prendre
West
sans
Bank,
délai
and
les
we
mesures
call on
nécessaires
Israel
pour
to immediately
protéger
adopt
la
the
population
necessary measures
palestinienne
to
dans les
protect the
territoires
Palestinian
occupés
population
et
in the
assurer le
occupied
respect
territories and
de
to
son droit à
ensure
l'éducation.
respect for the
Tout doit
right
être
to
fait pour éviter un
education.
embrasement
Everything
à
possible needs to
Jérusalem,
be done to
Est
avoid
et en
a
Cisjordanie. La
conflagration
France
in East
condamne les violences
Jerusalem and
commises
West
par les
Bank.
colons.
We
Elle déplore
condemn
les
violence
déplacements forcés
perpetrated
de
by
communautés
settlers.
palestiniennes.
We
À
lament
Jérusalem
the
Est,
enforced
le statu quo historique sur le lieu
displacements
saint
of
doit être
Palestinian
préservé.
communities in East Jerusalem.
La
The historic
résolution
status quo needs to
2334,
be
qui vise à
maintained of the holy
matérialiser la
sites.
distinction juridique
We call for
entre les
implementation
territoires
of
d'Israël reconnus par la
2334.
communauté
This
internationale et les
resolution,
territoires occupés doit être
which
pleinement respectée.
establishes a policy of
Madame la
distinction to legally
Présidente, la France exige un cessez-le-feu
distinguish
immédiat et
between
permanent
Israeli
et la
territory
libération sans délai de
recognized
tous
by the
les
international
otages.
community
Elle
and
condamne une fois de plus
occupied
les attaques
territories.
terroristes
We call for an
perpétrées
immediate
par le Hamas
permanent
et d'autres
ceasefire
groupes
and the
terroristes
immediate
le 7
release of all
octobre
hostages. We
2023.
once again condemn the
La
terrorist attacks
situation
perpetrated by Hamas
humanitaire
and other terrorist groups
est
on 7
devenue
October 2023.
intenable à
The humanitarian
Gaza. Il est
situation has
impératif de
become
garantir un
unbearable
accès
in
humanitaire
Gaza.
complet
There is an
afin que les
overriding need
populations
to
puissent
ensure
être secourues.
comprehensive humanitarian assistance
Il est plus
to
urgent que jamais
save
de poser les
populations.
bases d'un règlement politique
There is a
pour
need to
mettre en œuvre la solution
safeguard
des
the
deux
political
États
framework
qui
to
seul
implement the
peut assurer
two-state
aux
solution, which
Israéliens
alone
et aux
can
Palestiniens
ensure
la paix
that
et la sécurité.
Israelis and Palestinians
La
can
France
achieve
réaffirme
peace
son
and security.
attachement indéfectible
France
à la sécurité
reaffirms its
d'Israël
steadfast commitment to
et à
the security of
l'édification d'un
Israel
État
and
viable,
the
souverain
establishment
et
of a
contigu
viable,
pour les
sovereign,
Palestiniens.
and contiguous
Elle
state
appelle
for
de
the
ses vœux la
Palestinians.
mise en place
We
d'une
call for
autorité
the establishment of
palestinienne
a Palestinian
réformée,
authority that is
capable
reformed,
d'exercer ses
capable
responsabilités
of
sur l'ensemble des territoires palestiniens,
exercising
y
its
compris
responsibility
dans
in
la
all
bande
of
de Gaza.
Palestinian soil,
Les
including the
mesures
Gaza Strip.
visant à l'affaiblir doivent
Measures geared
cesser.
towards
La France
undermining
appelle
this must
Israël à
be
ne
put to
plus
an
faire
end.
obstacle
We
au
urge
transfert des
Israel no
revenus.
longer to impede
Elle reste
revenues
engagée
transfers.
pour prévenir
We
tout
remain
risque
committed to
d'escalade sur la
prevent
ligne bleue
any
et
risk of escalation
promouvoir
along the
une
blue
solution
line and for the
diplomatique.
advancement and
Nous
promotion of a
exhortons
diplomatic
l'ensemble des
solution.
acteurs dans la
We
région
urge all
à
stakeholders
adopter
in
une
the region
attitude
to adopt a
responsable.
responsible
Je vous remercie.
attitude. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, we meet in a period of deep uncertainty for the Middle East. We have warned, cautioned, and called for restraint. But with Lebanon rocked and shocked by indiscriminate communication devices explosion, we fear that we are at the cusp of the dreaded regional escalation, if not in it already. Sierra Leone shares the UN Secretary General's deep alarm and urge that all concerned actors exercise maximum restraint to avert any further escalation. Colleagues, we also meet at a time of great hope and the effective response by the General Assembly to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of 19th July 2024 on the legal consequences arising for the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and with the overwhelming vote to adopt the resolution that demands that Israel, and I quote, brings to an end without delay its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. The action of the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice advisory opinion do have bearing on our meeting today, and I therefore thank our briefers, Special Coordinator Mr. Tor Wennesland, and Ms. Helen Clark, Member of Elders and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, for their comprehensive and instructive briefings. Resolution 2334 underpins the relevance of international law and the Charter of the United Nations as it examines some of the fundamental causes of the decades-long Israel-Palestine conflict. The prolonged nature of the conflict partly stems from the problems of settlement, annexations, and blockades, and their destabilizing effect on the Palestinian people and their institutions. The painful realities resulting from the illegal settlement policies of Israel are evident in the lives of the Palestinians, whose basic freedoms and associated human rights are suppressed daily. In the Gaza Strip, the escalation of violence since the 7th October 2023 attack by Hamas on Israel civilians and the Israeli military response since then has had a huge humanitarian impact on the civilian population. Millions of Palestinian civilians live through a perpetual nightmare of fear, suffering, and trauma for Israeli bombs and guns, while civilians still grapple to access the basic services. A recent update from the World Food Programme highlighted that as winter approaches, the worsening security situation and damaged roads in Gaza will complicate the delivery of vital food, water, medicine, and hygiene supplies to areas where they are critical for the survival of communities. As reported by OCHA, hygiene items such as soap, shampoo, detergent, and sanitary pads for females are in short supply, and families struggle to maintain basic hygiene in overcrowded shelters, which has resulted in high-risk health conditions. The pattern of repeated evacuation orders and closures of crossing points for aid delivery continues to hamper humanitarian efforts and discourage humanitarian personnel, who also have to deal with the very real fear of being attacked and killed by IDF weapons. Further, we remain deeply concerned about the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where about 674 Palestinians, including 150 children, as confirmed by UNICEF, have been killed between the 7th October 2023 and 9th September 2024. The failure on the part of the conflict parties to take necessary precautions to spare and protect civilians is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone condemns the resumption of violence in the North and West Bank in Tulkarem, North Shams, and El Farah camps. As reported, this operation affected residential and commercial buildings, which resulted in interruption of basic services in the area. Such reports of increased self-violence, annexation, demolition, and displacement are all contrary to the provision of Resolution 2334, which stresses the cessation of all settlement activities and calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, as well as acts of provocations and destruction. The International Court of Justice, in its 19th July 2024 advisory opinion, importantly noted that since 1967, Israel's settlement policy has continued in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And before the removal of Israel's settlement from the Gaza Strip in 2005, Israel's settlement policy carried out in the Gaza Strip were not substantially different from the policy that continues in the West Bank and East Jerusalem today. The court, among other things, notes that Israel's construction of settlement is accompanied by a specially designed civilian infrastructure in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which integrates the settlement into the territory of Israel. The transfer by Israel of settlers to the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Israel's maintenance of their presence is found to be contrary to the 6th paragraph of Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention. Accordingly, and as noted by Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland, the ICJ is of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. In view of Security Council Resolution 2334 and this Council's mandate, The Security Council now stands in judgment of the member states of the United Nations and the international community as a whole. As the member of the Elders and former Prime Minister, Ms. Clark, asked, how will the UN Security Council respond? In keeping with the provisions of Resolution 2334, Sierra Leone would like to emphasize the following points. First, the establishment of Israeli settlement in Palestinian territory continues and constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution. New settlement activities must cease immediately and all settlers evacuated from the occupied Palestinian territory. Second, parties to the conflict are reminded of their obligations to comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, the ICJ binding provisional measures on the parties, and customary international law that has been crystallized by the International Court of Justice, even in advisory opinions. Third, we support international efforts towards resumption of peace negotiations to end the hostilities in the Gaza Strip, as endorsed in Security Council Resolution 2735, and that will set in place and in motion a political settlement. The ongoing tireless effort of the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States needs the impartial support of the international community, especially states with influence on the conflicting parties. Let me close, Madam President, by reiterating Sierra Leone's support for ongoing initiatives geared towards a reformed governance structure of the Palestinian Authority that would guarantee its access to resources and further strengthen its autonomy and influence. The two-state solution needs a strengthened Palestinian Authority, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank Mr. Tor Wennesland and Ms. Helen Clark, member of the Elders, for their briefing on the current settlement situation in Palestine occupied territories. Madam President, the Israel settlement in the occupied Palestinian territories remains a matter of grave concern, exacerbated by the complex political, social, and humanitarian implications for both Israelis and Palestinians. The heightened tensions in the Gaza Strip and the potential for regional conflict escalation further complicate the already tense situation. Recent reports indicate the presence of 600,000 to 750,000 Israeli settlers in at least 250 settlements across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, involving the transfer of Israel's civilian population into occupied territories. Mindful of the gravity of the situation, the International Court of Justice recently issued an advisory opinion declaring that Israel's settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territories, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem, violate international law. The court also emphasized that these settlements and the associated policies amount to de facto annexations and systematic discrimination against Palestinians. This ruling has significant implications as it calls for Israel to cease all new settlement activities and evacuate settlers from these territories. Furthermore, we acknowledge the United Nations General Assembly resolution adopted yesterday, September 18, 2024, demanding that Israel ends its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. This resolution calls for Israel to comply with the international law, cease all new settlement activity, evacuate settlers, and dismantle parts of the separation wall within West Bank. The Security Council Resolution 2334, the ICJ's orders, and the recent UN General Assembly resolutions collectively provide a robust foundation for our concerted action. These instruments reflect the international community's steadfast commitment to addressing this situation and pursuing a just, lasting, and sustainable peace in the region. They also demonstrated the human awareness by the international community for justice and the noble cause for Palestine. Madam President, we emphasize the crucial role of the international community, including this Security Council, in facilitating dialogue and negotiation between the parties involved and addressing the root causes of the conflict, such as the issue of land ownership and the status of Jerusalem. Madam President, Mozambique, drawing from its own historical experiences with conflict, strongly opposes the forced displacement of the Palestinian population, particularly women and children. We strongly urge for the full implementation in good faith of all relevant instruments related to settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories to reverse the ongoing situation and suffering. Mozambique reaffirms its unwavering support for the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination. Mozambique also recognizes the right to existence of the State of Israel. This dual recognition serves as a foundation for peaceful coexistence, envisioning both nations as independent and sovereign states in accordance with Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967 and other UN relevant resolutions. In conclusion, Madam President, we call upon all parties to engage in constructive dialogue, adhere to international law, and work towards a peaceful resolution that ensures the rights and security of both Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and Ms. Clark for their respective updates and briefings. The current catastrophe in Gaza began with the horrifying acts of terror by Hamas and other militant groups. We reiterate our strong condemnation of the 7th October attack, as well as the taking and killing of hostages. Hostages are enduring an unimaginable horror, which is totally unacceptable. At the same time, the conflict rages on with no end in sight, and the suffering of the Palestinians only grows. Japan is appalled at the unconscionable toll of deaths and injuries, including many civilians and even UN staff and aid workers. The devastation of the Palestinian people is beyond our comprehension. They are trying to survive in overcrowded makeshift shelters and tents, while suffering a severe shortage of essential supplies and restricted access to basic services. No human should have to experience what they have experienced for nearly a year now. Beyond Gaza, the conflict continues to spread. In the West Bank, we are concerned by the casualties and level of destruction following Israel's recent military operations. Japan condemns continued settlement expansion and violence and seizures of land by Israeli settlers. This must cease. 24 hours ago, the General Assembly adopted the resolution regarding the ICJ advisory opinion. We underscore once again that the settlements are in violation of international law, as was pointed out in the ICJ advisory opinion. With regard to Lebanon, we are seriously concerned about the alarming incidents in this week, which reportedly caused multiple casualties and thousands of injuries. Continued attacks across the Blue Line are very dangerous. No one desires a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah. We must all do all we can do to avoid one. Madam President, we must change the course of the never-ending vicious cycle of violence in the Middle East. Let me make 3 points in this regard. First, we need an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages based on the outlines of the Security Council Resolution 2735. Japan continues to support the tireless mediation efforts of the US, Egypt, and Qatar to bring this about. A ceasefire in Gaza will also help bring calm to the inflamed region. Second, even before ceasefire is achieved, the international community must make plans for early recovery and reconstruction in Gaza. Just removing the rubble will take decades, while restoration of the basic civil system and infrastructure, including health and education, will require enormous time and resources. These are only some of the numerous challenges we will face on the day after. In this vein, it is imperative to strengthen the Palestinian Authority, including financial governance capacities. Third, and finally, a two-state solution is the only viable path to resolve this decades-long tragic conflict. Japan sincerely hopes to see a Middle East where Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and stability with recognized borders, and will spare no efforts to this end. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Señora Presidenta, en primer lugar,
Madam
agradezco al
President, let me
coordinador
begin
especial
by
Tor
thanking
Wennesland
Special
por
Coordinator
su
Tor
informe esta
Wennesland for
mañana.
his briefing this
Reitero el
morning.
apoyo del Ecuador
I
para sus
reiterate
labores
Ecuador's
y
support
las
for
de
his
todo el
work
personal de
and the
Naciones
work of
Unidas y
all
sus
UN
agencias. Quiero
staff
agradecer
and
también a la señora
agencies.
Clark
I'm also
por su
grateful to
valioso
Ms.
aporte.
Clark for her valuable contribution.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam
Gaza ha sido
President,
llamado el lugar más
Gaza has
peligroso del
been
mundo
called
para
the
las
most
actividades
dangerous
humanitarias.
place in the world for
Yo creo que sin
humanitarian
duda lo es.
activities, and I think that is
Y los
undoubtedly
acontecimientos de
true.
los últimos días y semanas
Events in
así
the
lo han
past
confirmado.
days and weeks are proof of
Por
that.
ello, la provisión urgente y
And
suficiente de ayuda
therefore,
humanitaria
the urgent
es
and
una
sufficient
necesidad.
supply of
Es
humanitarian aid
inaceptable que se
is a
pongan obstáculos al
necessity.
ingreso o a la
Any
distribución de ayuda.
barriers to the delivery or
Es
distribution of
condenable
aid
todo ataque contra el
is
personal humanitario.
unacceptable. Any
Los
attack
mecanismos
against
de conflicto
humanitarian
deben
personnel
ser
is
efectivos
condemnable.
y confiables.
Deconfliction
Es difícil
mechanisms
creer
must be
que
effective
a casi
and
un año del
reliable.
inicio de la
It's
guerra
difficult to believe
aún no
that
lo sean.
almost a year
El
after the war
incidente del
began,
28 de
these
agosto en el que se
mechanisms
abrió
are
fuego
not yet
contra un
effective
convoy
or
del Programa
reliable.
Mundial de Alimentos es particularmente alarmante.
The incident on the 28th
Los
of
combates
August,
no cesan
when
mientras
a
alrededor de
World
100
Food
rehenes
Program
continúan
convoy
en
was fired
cautiverio
upon, is
casi un año
particularly
después de los actos
alarming.
terroristas perpetrados por
Fighting has
Hamas
continued
el
while
7 de
some
octubre del
100
2023,
hostages remain
que
in
incluyeron
captivity
abusos
almost a year
y
after the
violaciones a
terrorist
mujeres en
acts
Israel
perpetrated by
y que una vez
Hamas
más
on
el
the
Ecuador
7th of
condena
October
firmemente.
2023, which
Señora
includes abuse
Presidenta,
and rape of women in
esta
Israel.
situación es
And once again,
desalentadora,
this is a situation
sobre
Ecuador
todo tomando en
condemns.
cuenta que
Madam
hace ya 3
President, this
meses
situation is
este
discouraging,
Consejo adoptó
particularly
una resolución de
when
apoyo a una
3 months
propuesta de
ago
alto al
this
fuego
council
que,
adopted a
de haber
resolution
sido
in support
implementada,
of a proposed
habría
ceasefire.
cesado las hostilidades,
If that ceasefire
habría
had been
permitido la
implemented,
liberación de los rehenes,
it would have ended
habría facilitado que
hostilities,
la
it
ayuda
would have led to
humanitaria
the release
llegue de
of
forma segura,
hostages, it would have
suficiente y
facilitated
oportuna
the
a todos los
delivery
que la
of
necesitan.
humanitarian aid,
Y también
safely in sufficient
habría
quantities and in
contribuido
a
a
timely
reducir las
manner
tensiones de la
to
región.
all those in need,
Los
and it
acontecimientos en
would have
Cisjordania
contributed to
tampoco son
reducing tension
alentadores.
in the
El
region.
país,
Events in
en
the
línea
West
con la
Bank are no more
declaración de
encouraging.
presidencia de este Consejo de
My
febrero del
country, in line with
2023,
the
se opone
presidential statement made
enérgicamente
in
a
the
todas las
Council in
medidas
February 2023,
unilaterales
is firmly
que
opposed to
obstaculizan la
any
paz y
unilateral
ponen en
measures
riesgo la solución
which obstruct
biestatal,
peace
como la construcción
and
y expansión de los
endanger
asentamientos,
the two-state
la
solution,
confiscación
such
de
as the
tierras,
construction and expansion of
la
settlements, the
legalización de
seizure
los
of land,
asentamientos de
the
avanzada,
legalization of settler
la demolición de
outposts,
viviendas
the demolition of
y el
housing,
desplazamiento de
and the
civiles.
displacement of civilians.
La muerte
the death of Aisanur Egi, circumstances and accountability for that act must be investigated exhaustively, and repeated attacks by settlers are examples of the constant risk that Palestinian civilians in the West Bank face. Madam President, colleagues, the vicious cycle of destruction, death, and vengeance must end now. To that end, it is time for the leaders to act with courage and humanity. I will conclude my statement by reiterating my country's conviction that the only way out is to work towards a peaceful, definitive, and just solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and relevant resolutions. We must act with pragmatism and realism to enable that solution to take shape. It is supported by the vast majority of the international community.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Special Coordinator Wennesland and Helen Clark for their briefings today. The death toll in Gaza has reached over 40,000. Water, sanitation and health infrastructure has been almost completely destroyed. Disease and the risk of famine pose further deadly threats. And Israel continues to reckon with the appalling toll of October the 7th, with 101 hostages still held captive in Gaza, subject to unspeakable horror. Elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territories and across the region, tensions are escalating. We need to see three things. First, an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and ramping up of aid in Gaza. A deal is a best way to get the hostages home. Force will not provide a sustainable solution to the conflict. The ceasefire and hostage deal, driven by the commendable efforts of the US, Qatar and Egypt, has to be finalised as a matter of urgency. We call upon Hamas and Israel to agree the deal and, in the meantime, for Hamas to grant the ICRC humanitarian access to the hostages whose ordeal continues. Our message to Hamas: let them go. With winter fast approaching, we call on Israel to take swift action to allow the UN and humanitarian actors to do their job. By making deconfliction work, reopening land routes for aid, and supporting preparations for winter by allowing a rapid increase in the volume of items for shelter and infrastructure repair. Second, we must address the deteriorating situation in the West Bank. Expansion of settlements, in clear violation of international law, undermines prospects for peace and must cease immediately. We have witnessed with grave concern how an increasing number of Israeli settlers have systematically used harassment, intimidation and violence to pressure Palestinian communities to leave their land. We call on Israel to hold those responsible to account. We reiterate our clear position that any attempt to alter the geographic or demographic makeup of the occupied Palestinian territories through the use of force and outside a negotiated solution is wholly unacceptable and illegal. We also call for an end to the divisive and inflammatory rhetoric we have seen from some Israeli ministers, which serves to fuel aggression towards Palestinians and humanitarian workers. Finally, we need to galvanize a political process towards a two-state solution. As the ICJ has advised, Israel should bring an end to its presence in the occupied territories as rapidly as possible. The UK is clear This must be done through a negotiated solution with reunification of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in line with 1967 borders and under the effective control of the Palestinian Authority. Peace must be premised upon a safe and secure Israel alongside a safe and secure Palestinian state. I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente, je vous remercie, Excellence, pour votre présence aujourd'hui et pour l'organisation de ce débat trimestriel. Je remercie aussi le coordinateur spécial pour sa présentation du rapport du secrétaire général portant sur la mise en œuvre de la résolution 2334 et je remercie Ms. Helen Clark de son exposé. La Suisse soutient la Cour internationale de justice ainsi que son avis consultatif du 19 juillet. L'illégalité de l'occupation israélienne du territoire palestinien qui court depuis 1967 ne fait maintenant aucun doute. Elle doit cesser et un horizon politique doit être rétabli. Nous restons convaincus que la solution à deux États est la seule option possible pour qu'Israéliens et Palestiniens vivent côte à côte en paix, en sécurité et en dignité, à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues, conformément au droit international et aux paramètres convenus au niveau international. À cette fin, la Suisse salue le fait que la résolution adoptée hier reconnaisse la nécessité de relancer un processus pour aboutir à une solution à deux États. Nous soutenons l'appel à la tenue d'une conférence de paix sous l'égide de l'ONU durant la 79e session de l'Assemblée générale. Pour sa part, la Suisse, en tant qu'État dépositaire des conventions de Genève et de ses protocoles additionnels, honorera le mandat que lui a conféré hier l'Assemblée générale et organisera une conférence de haute partie contractante dans un délai de 6 mois. Conformément à l'article 1 commun aux conventions de Genève, il est en effet impératif de respecter et de faire respecter le droit international humanitaire, y compris dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé. Des mesures concrètes doivent être immédiatement prises pour protéger la population civile. Madame la Présidente, depuis le 7 octobre, les attaques, menaces et intimidations des colons contre les civils, y compris le personnel humanitaire, ont augmenté exponentiellement en Cisjordanie. Un exemple parmi tant d'autres est l'attaque menée lundi par des colons contre une école primaire près de Jéricho, au cours de laquelle au moins 7 élèves et enseignants ont été blessés, selon le rapport. La Suisse condamne de telles attaques qui, avec la construction des colonies, contribuent à la création d'un environnement coercitif et conduisent au déplacement forcé des communautés palestiniennes. À cela s'ajoute une intensification des opérations militaires israéliennes. L'usage de la force lors de ces opérations doit répondre aux critères de nécessité et de proportionnalité et respecter le droit de tout individu à la vie et à la sécurité. Aussi, la Suisse condamne les annonces des dirigeants israéliens visant à l'expansion des colonies illégales en vertu du droit international humanitaire, l'établissement d'une nouvelle colonie en législant un avant-poste dans le Wadi al-Mahloul, près de Bethléem, dans une zone listée par l'UNESCO au patrimoine de l'humanité, est le dernier exemple d'une série de décisions similaires qui sabotent la solution à deux États. À Gaza, les hostilités continuent de faire de nombreuses victimes civiles sur fond de crise humanitaire catastrophique. Le succès de la première vague de vaccination contre la polio montre que des opérations humanitaires d'envergure peuvent être menées à Gaza moyennant une sincère volonté politique. Les parties doivent respecter le droit international humanitaire et faciliter un accès humanitaire sûr, rapide et sans entrave aux civils dans le besoin, y compris les otages, dont nous appelons à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle. Un cessez-le-feu est nécessaire de toute urgence. Ce Conseil l'a clairement exigé à travers ses résolutions 2728 et 2735 qui doivent être mises en œuvre. Nous soutenons les efforts de médiation des États-Unis, de Qatar et de l'Égypte à cet effet. Ceci est essentiel pour prévenir une escalade encore plus grave dans la région. La Suisse est très préoccupée par les explosions survenues au Liban le 17 et le 18 septembre et les rapports de nombreuses victimes civiles. Nous appelons toutes les parties à exercer la plus grande retenue et à œuvrer par une désescalade immédiate. Nous appelons également toutes les parties au respect du droit international humanitaire, notamment le principe de distinction, de proportionnalité et de précaution en toutes circonstances. La Suisse se tient à disposition au sein de ce Conseil comme en dehors pour contribuer à restaurer la paix et la sécurité dans la région. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China. Algeria. Amar, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin my statement by expressing my gratitude to Mr. Wennesland for his alarming briefings. A briefing in which he once again underscores the stark realities in the Middle East. In his report, the word most used by Mr. Wennesland was killing, killed, kills. I wish also to extend my thanks to Mrs. Helen Clark for her remarks and especially for her recommendation. Today, we are called upon to take a serious and clear stand against the deteriorating situation in the region. The primary task of this very Council is the maintenance of international peace and security. This cannot be achieved through fleeting words eloquently delivered before the cameras. The gravity of the situation in the Middle East requires more than rhetoric. It demands decisive and swift action. Everyone under this roof must recognize that the region is on the edge of an abyss or a precipice, as you have stated, Mr. President. If it falls into its darkness, the consequences will be far-reaching, and no one, yes, no one will be immune. We must heed the lessons of history to prevent the worst, which is not less than a full-fledged regional war. Mr. President, the Israeli occupying power continues its apartheid policies, relentlessly pursuing plans for ethnic cleansing in Gaza and pushing the West Bank to the brink of chaos. The occupying power is also creating new fait accompli on the ground. This year alone, we have witnessed unprecedented level of settlement, of expansion, of annexation of land. It is evident that Resolution 2334 has had no tangible impact. The Israeli occupier act with impunity, as if operating in a lawless jungle. It continues to renege on previous agreement and consistently violate international law. International law, the very foundation of civilized society. If we are serious about protecting future generations from the scourge of war, as we pledged in the United Nations Charter, the solution is clear. There can be no peace in the Middle East without the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Mr. President, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, delivered on July the 19th of this year, is addressed to the General Assembly and to this Council alike. The Court stated that the precise modalities for ending Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian Authority, in the occupied Palestinian territory, are matters for both the General Assembly and the Security Council to address. The General Assembly has already heeded this call by adopting just yesterday, a resolution. Will this Council remain deaf to the demand of the Court? Will it continue to disregard the principle that underpin the United Nations? What will remain to the Council if it does not respond to the order of its highest judicial body? It is the inaction of this Council that encourage the Israeli occupying power to continue its brutal policies. The deteriorating situation in the occupying Palestinian territory, as highlighted by Mr. Wennesland's briefing, illustrate the terror endured by Palestinians, a terror that spares no one, not even children, and no Palestinian, regardless of gender, of age, has been spared from this violence. And yet, we see no investigation into the killing of Palestinians. However, the Israeli authorities rush to investigate the death of foreigners, but not of Palestinians. Definitely not. These double standards in the death reveals a profound disregard of Palestinian lives, a contempt rooted in the hateful racism that the world has long condemned. For us, Palestinian lives also matter. Today, the human rights principle seems to have been monopolized by one group at the expense of another. Colleagues, today we urgently need decisions backed by a robust follow-up and accountability mechanism. This is why my country reaffirms its belief that for those who reject peace, for those who don't believe in peace, peace must be imposed upon them. The Council has a legal and moral responsibility to act, and we cannot afford to remain passive spectators. This Council possesses the tools and the authority needed to respond, but only if there is the political will to rise up to the challenge. If we fail in this duty, the Council risks becoming a mere platform for speeches, rather than the guardian of international peace and security that it was created to be. Mr. President, it is time to move beyond narrow calculations and take the necessary step, the necessary binding decision that will restore peace and security in our region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and Ms. Clark for their briefings. Yesterday, the GA Emergency Special Session overwhelmingly adopted the draft resolution tabled by the State of Palestine demanding the implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion. At this critical juncture, when the world is grappling with the prolonged Gazan conflict and complex and intractable situation in the Middle East, the adoption of the resolution is a historic landmark. The resolution demands Israel to end its unlawful presence in the OPT. Independent statehood is an inalienable national right of the Palestinian people, but the prolonged illegal occupation prevents the Palestinian people from realizing national self-determination and gives Israel an exclusive veto over Palestinian statehood. Occupation will not make Israel more secure, but would only breed more hatred and antagonism and perpetuate a vicious cycle of violent clashes between Palestinians and Israelis. Only an end to occupation and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine will lead to the peaceful coexistence of Palestine and Israel and lasting peace and security in the Middle East. The resolution urges all parties to stop arming Israel in its maintenance of the occupation. Military means is not a solution to the problem. Tit-for-tat violence would only exacerbate hatred. The conflict has cost the lives of many Palestinian and Israeli civilians in several decades, with the bloodshed and carnage continuing today. To tackle the question of Palestine needs political will and diplomatic efforts, not an endless stream of arms and ammunition and violent conflicts. All peace-loving nations should respond to the cause of the resolution and work towards that end. The resolution reaffirms international rule of law must be upheld. International law is the cornerstone of the international order and a body of international norms that must be respected by all parties. There is no exception to the fulfillment of obligations under international law. All states are equal before international law. Any double standard or selective applications are unacceptable. As a member of the international community and a UN member state, Israel must fulfill its legal obligations, implement the relevant Security Council resolutions, and comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law. The resolution calls for the accelerated implementation of the two-state solution. Past decades saw Israel's continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank, encroaching on Palestinian territory and squeezing the space and viability of Palestine as a state. Israel's actions continue to erode the foundation of the two-state solution and increasingly reveal its rejection of and resistance to the two-state solution. The international community must act with utmost urgency to revitalize the prospects of the two-state solution. China supports the proposal in the GA resolution to hold an international peace conference under the auspices of the GA to discuss the implementation of relevant UN resolutions and the two-state solution. President, the GA resolution adopted yesterday embodies the broad consensus of the international community in promoting the resolution of the question in Palestine. It testifies to the resolve of the international community to uphold justice and realize peace in the Middle East. The Security Council should heed the calls of the international community and respond effectively to its concerns. Regrettably, due to the negative attitude of one individual country, the Security Council has long been unable to take strong action to resolve the Palestinian question, let alone to stop the almost one-year-old Gazan conflict. More than 3 months ago, when pushing for the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2735, the U.S. claimed that Israel had accepted the ceasefire deal, but facts seem otherwise. For more than 3 months, we have borne witness instead to the constantly intensifying Israeli military operations, mounting number of conditions for negotiations, and escalating provocations. Not a single moment should be wasted in the quest for lasting ceasefire and the easing of humanitarian catastrophe. But the U.S. instead has repeatedly asked for more time and patience for diplomatic efforts. In the meantime, the Gazan civilians are paying for more time and patience with their lives and suffering. How come the time and patience needed by the U.S. are so costly? The spillover effect of the continued Gazan fighting is manifesting itself at a greater pace. Lebanon and Israel on the verge of all-out conflict, imperiling peace and stability of the entire Middle East. China urges Israel to abandon its obsession with the use of force and its illusion of seeking a complete military victory, immediately cease its military operations in Gaza, cease infringements on Lebanon's sovereignty and security, and stop any risk-taking that might well plunge the region into another conflagration. We support the Security Council in using all available options in its toolbox to promote the implementation of relevant resolutions and taking further actions to put an early end to the war, mitigate humanitarian catastrophe, and realize peace in the Middle East in a timely fashion. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I begin by thanking Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing and Ms. Helen Clark for her important statement. President, today we are discussing the implementation of Resolution 2334, which unequivocally states that Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory constitute a flagrant violation of international law and are a major obstacle to the two-state solution. In its advisory opinion of 19 July, the International Court of Justice reaffirmed that settlements are unlawful under international law and must come to an immediate halt. The court further emphasized Israel's obligation to end this occupation, halt all settlement activity, and evacuate existing settlers. Yesterday, the General Assembly overwhelmingly voted in favor of modalities which would ensure that this advisory opinion is fully respected and implemented. Malta voted in favor of this historic resolution and calls on Israel to end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. Meanwhile, the conditions in Gaza remain unbearable, and the security and humanitarian situation in the occupied West Bank continues to degrade rapidly and steadily. Since 7 October, nearly 700 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israeli incursions in Palestinian cities now regularly comprise of military operations, which include airstrikes, destruction of infrastructure, and the unlawful use of force. The latest operation targeting militants and refugee camps left 36 Palestinians dead, including 8 children. Malta once again condemns any acts targeting and endangering civilian life. Palestinians are forced to contend with mass arbitrary detainment and reports of other types of mistreatment and disturbing reports of sexual violence. Incessant attacks and intimidation from Israeli settlers has resulted in several deaths and injuries, damage of property, and forced displacement. Amid traumatizing violent raids, insecurity, and traumatic conditions, mothers and their children have extremely limited access to maternal and reproductive health care and face unthinkable mental challenges. We strongly emphasize the importance of ensuring that aid distribution considers the specific needs of women and girls. At the same time, while such mitigation efforts are important, they do not address the root cause of the insecurity. We stress that as the occupying power, Israel must abide by its obligations under international law and protect the Palestinian population against all acts or threats of violence. President, the restoration of a political horizon must remain central to our efforts. This must start with an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the safe return of hostages to Israel, and adequate humanitarian relief for the Gazan population in line with Council Resolution 2735. This must be accompanied with de-escalatory efforts in the wider region, including along the Blue Line, which can only be achieved through diplomatic progress. Also integral is the provision of fiscal and political support to the Palestinian Authority, enabling it to effectively govern over the West Bank and Gaza, while ensuring its active participation in discussions surrounding Gaza's recovery. In conclusion, President, the international community must unite behind an irreversible realization of the two-state solution in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters, which puts an end to the occupation and ensures that the Palestinian aspirations for statehood and Israel's security are equally fulfilled. This is the only way to bring a lasting end to unprecedented suffering in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Tor Wennesland, for the comprehensive briefing about the situation on occupied Palestinian territories, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of the Jordan River. We also thank Madam Helen Clark for her briefing. The General Assembly yesterday adopted a genuinely historic resolution reaffirming the advisory opinion of the ICJ, which clearly highlights the unlawful nature of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and the need to put this to an end. We are heartened by the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Council's membership supported this initiative to achieve a just settlement and a long-term resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and to uphold the right of the Palestinians to establish their own state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. This result is a clear testament to the fact that the resolution to this issue is long overdue. At the same time, in discussions at the Council on the situation in the OPT for a number of months, thanks to the efforts of our Western colleagues, these discussions have been rather mundane and routine, and this despite the fact that every day dozens and hundreds of Palestinians are dying. In the nearly 1 year of Israeli operations in Gaza, more than 41,000 Palestinians have died. The majority are women and children. At least 100,000 people have been wounded. Tens of thousands are missing persons. And yet Palestinians are dying not just in Gaza. The West Bank, where objectively less attention at the Council is paid attention to, is enduring an equally tragic crisis. More than 600 Palestinians have been killed, more than 5,000 wounded. During the recent Tzahal summer camps operation alone, 39 Palestinians, including 8 children, were killed using drones, artillery, and missiles. They wrought havoc targeting civilian infrastructure. Roads have been destroyed, water and electricity lines destroyed, and administrative buildings have also been destroyed. Before our very eyes, taking advantage of the Council's paralysis, Thanks to the U.S.'s efforts, the Israeli leadership is seeking and is achieving the objective to expel the West Bank's Palestinian population. Settlement activity has been ratcheted up at a record rate where there's a de facto colonization of Palestinian lands. More and more settler outposts are being established in parallel. Palestinian homes are being demolished in East Jerusalem and Area C. Law enforcement is absolutely indifferent to violence by radically minded settlers against local civilians, and yet none of our Western colleagues have voiced any concern about the erasure of Palestinian identity, even though now we are not even talking just about that. We are talking about the literal erasure of the Palestinian people. They're being wiped out from the face of the earth. Israel is not limiting itself to rendering Gaza uninhabitable. Western Jerusalem is deliberately adopting measures making the lives of Palestinians unbearable in the West Bank too. As Israel continues to withhold Ramallah's clearance revenues, unemployment in the West Bank has reached 40%. The lack of roads and proliferation of Israeli checkpoints means that the staff of agencies located in neighboring cities cannot get to work. The settlers are carrying out raids targeting agricultural sites. As a result of Israeli attacks, 69 schools and 5 universities have been damaged, depriving children and young people of access to education. All of this attests to the West Jerusalem's persistent policy to resolve in addressing the Palestinian issue with the use by creating irreversible effects on the ground, brute force and financial pressure. Israeli authorities are fear nothing, for the boundless support from Washington allows Israel to elude responsibility for any crimes. The rapidly deteriorating situation in the West Bank requires a reaction from the Security Council in the same extent, just as the appalling situation in Gaza does. Palestinian civilians are dying there too, and they are losing their homes there too. We all perfectly are aware of the fact that what is taking place is the targeted, deliberate policy of the Israeli authorities, and this can there can be no justification for collective punishment of all Palestinians. However, the Council remains inactive. Unfortunately, its effective efforts on Middle East settlement have continuously been blocked by the U.S., which pushed through a resolution 2735, which is completely unviable, and the U.S. continues to block any attempts to set out a just assessment of Israeli actions, even in the context of the inadmissibility of imperiling the lives and health of UN and humanitarian personnel in Gaza. Let us recall that since October 7, the U.S. has cast 5 vetoes to shield its ally and to block the adoption of a clear demand from the Council for a ceasefire. The one thing that the Americans expect from the Security Council is to exert pressure on Hamas, not to get in the way of Israel on the ground, and this despite the fact that the vaunted deal actually has repeatedly been blocked by none other than Israel, for whose benefit the U.S. essentially has been violating Resolution 2735, which did set out parameters for this agreement, even though this was diluted. Colleagues, against the backdrop of the growing demand from the entire international community for a modicum of concrete measures to alleviate and improve the situation in OPT, the members of the Council simply must summon political will and courage and adopt a decision for a ceasefire in Gaza and measures to enforce compliance therewith. Pressure needs to be exerted not so much on Hamas, but rather on our American colleagues who continue to regard both the Council and multilateral diplomacy as a whole as an unneeded burden. Your hard-headed policy to reject the authority of the Security Council and the UN as a whole not only failed to generate any progress in the context of resolving the current conflict, but it has also caused this conflict to continue for nearly a year, with the risk of this metastasizing into a full-blown regional conflict.
Не прекращаются обстрелы
There are
вдоль голубой
ongoing
линии с
attacks
Ливаном.
along the blue line with Lebanon.
Произвольные
The
воздушные удары по
arbitrary
Сирии,
airstrikes on Syria
а
are
также
ongoing,
точечные
as
ликвидации
are
обеих
the
сторон.
targeted liquidations on both sides.
В этом контексте
In this
решительно
context,
осуждаем
we strongly
беспрецедентную
condemn the
кибератаку на
unprecedented cyber
дружественный
attack
Ливан и
on,
его граждан,
on the friendly country of
которое
Lebanon and its
представляет собой
citizens,
грубое нарушение
which
его
constitutes a
суверенитета
gross
и
violation of its
является
sovereignty
серьезным
and
вызовом
constitutes
международному
a
праву.
grave threat to and challenge to international law.
Рассматриваем
We
произошедшее
view what
как очередной
transpired
акт
as
гибридной
yet
войны
another
против
act of
Ливана,
hybrid
от
warfare
которого
against
пострадали
Lebanon,
тысячи ни в
which
чем не
caused
повинных
suffering
людей.
of thousands entirely innocent people.
На фоне возрастающей
Against the backdrop
напряженности
of
в Ливане и
growing
израильском
tensions in
приграничье,
Lebanon and the Israeli border areas,
подобные безответственные
such
действия
reckless
чреваты крайне
actions are fraught
опасными
with
последствиями,
highly dangerous
ведущими к
consequences,
дальнейшей дестабилизации
resulting in further
военно-политической обстановки
destabilization
в
of the
регионе
military-political
Ближнего Востока.
situation in the Middle East region.
Происходящие в эти
The
минуты эскалации
developments
на юге
at
Ливана
present and escalation
и
in the south of
бомбардировки
Lebanon
израильской
and
авиации
Israeli
четко
airstrikes
показывают, к
clearly
какой опасной
show
черте
the
подошел
dangerous
арабо-израильский
threshold that the Israeli-Arab conflict has reached.
Господин председатель,
Mr.
Россия с самого
President,
начала
Russia from the very
нынешнего
beginning of this
кризиса
crisis has
последовательно выступает за постоянное
consistently
и повсеместное
advocated
прекращение
a
огня,
permanent and comprehensive
устойчивый и безопасный
ceasefire,
гуманитарный
sustained
доступ,
and secure
освобождение
humanitarian
всех
access,
заложников
the
и
release of all
насильственно
hostages
удерживаемых
and forcibly detained
а также
persons,
перезапуск
as well as
мирного
the
процесса
relaunch
на
of the peace
двугосударственной
process on a
основе,
two-state basis,
итогом которого
the
было бы
result of
создание
which would be the
палестинского
establishment of a
государства,
Palestinian state
сосуществующего в мире
coexisting in
безопасности с
peace and
Израилем
security with
в
Israel
соответствии с
in
одобренными
accordance with
международно-правовыми
the
решениями.
approved international legal decisions.
И мы готовы
And we
поддержать
stand
любую
ready to
конструктивную
support any
инициативу в Совете,
constructive initiative
направленную
from
на
the
реализацию
Council
этих целей.
to attain these
Хочется
objectives.
верить,
We should like to
что
hope that
необходимость
the
решительных
need
коллективных
for
мер по
decisive
остановке
collective
действий Израиля
measures
станет
to
очевидной для
halt
наших
Israeli
американских
operations will
коллег.
become clear to our U.S.
Пока
colleagues
же
as
цену
well.
за их
For now, the
трудолюбость и
cost
имперские
of their
амбиции платят своими жизнями
hard-headedness and
палестинские женщины
imperialistic
и
ambitions
дети.
are
Благодарю
being paid for with the lives of Palestinian
I
women
thank the
and children.
representative
Thank you.
of Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, Palestine welcomes the Foreign Minister of Slovenia presiding over this meeting of the Security Council, and we thank her for her statement as well. Allow me at the outset to thank the briefers for their presentations. We thank the Honorable Ms. Helen Clark for her significant contribution to our deliberations, and through her express deepest gratitude to the elders for their moral leadership in this time of unprecedented crisis. Mr. President, the situation in the occupied Palestine is beyond grave. And though televised across the world, the suffering of the Palestinian people under Israel's illegal occupation remains truly untold. There are no words left to describe Gaza's agony. But the reality is that what Gaza needs is not more words, but actions. Israel speaks in bombs and bullets, in displacement and destruction, in starvation and trauma. It claims for itself all the rights afforded by international law and the Charter of this United Nations, while rejecting and breaching all the obligations. It has a unique understanding of international law that somehow makes the crimes of genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing legal when perpetrated by Israel. Your role is to uphold international law, not to bend the law to fit Israelis' breaches, not to sacrifice the Charter to accommodate Israel. That is the action needed. To uphold international law, to implement UN resolutions, including 2334, which we are debating and discussing and reporting on its implementation. Not merely more words to decry this abhorrent situation. Mr. President, the ICJ, the highest judicial organ made clear, unequivocal determinations. Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must be brought to an end as rapidly as possible. It shouldered its responsibility, it made the ruling, it gave the historic advisory opinion. In this historic advisory opinion, the court reaffirmed the illegality of Israeli settlements and associated regime, including the wall across the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, stressing the obligations of the occupying power to cease immediately all settlement activities and to evacuate its settlers from our territory. The settlements were clearly recognized as one of the main engines of this illegal occupation, and the court recalled this Council's numerous relevant resolutions, including Resolution 2334, and its demand for a cessation of all Israeli settlement activities, and the need to respect and implement those resolutions forthwith. The court reminded Israel, all states, the United Nations of their respective obligations under international law. Yesterday, the General Assembly, by an overwhelming majority, voted to endorse the court's determinations and to spell out the actions and set up the mechanisms necessary to ensure compliance. The General Assembly adopted this resolution, the first ever presented by the State of Palestine under the Uniting for Peace formula in an emergency special session convened because of the failure of the Security Council to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and to bring this illegal 57-year occupation to an end. So the court acted and gave an opinion, historic one. The General Assembly acted based on the request of the court to adopt modalities for bringing this illegal occupation to an end as quickly as possible. Two important bodies of the United Nations shouldered their responsibilities because there are no veto power in these two institutions. Will the Security Council follow them and act in accordance with the mandate given to the Security Council and the Charter of the United Nations to maintain international peace and security? That is the big question before you, Mr. President. The historic resolution adopted by the General Assembly yesterday has embodied the collective will to act, and we have every intention to follow up on every aspect of the resolution and to react to any failure to comply without delay. There will be a report in 3 months by the Secretary General based on the resolution and the advisory opinion. Those who would comply with their obligations and international law, led by Israel, the occupying power, and those who do not comply, and then we will ask the General Assembly to take the necessary step. We will not relent until we see this illegal occupation end as quickly as possible, as the General Assembly stated, within 12 months. Mr. President, what the court determined is wholly and directly relevant to the duties of this Council. It stated inter alia that, and I quote, the sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful. Unlawful. End of quotation. If we needed to identify two cardinal rules, two pillars on which the international law-based order was built, two principles whose respect was critical for international peace and security, they would be the right of peoples to self-determination and the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force, and these are the rules that Israel has been breaching openly, brazenly, for decades without consequences. The ICJ and General Assembly were able to rise to the historic and tragic challenge before us. When will the Security Council, the body entrusted with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, step up and live up to its mandate and defend these cardinal principles to ensure the survival of the international law-based order? It has been 8 years since the Council adopted Resolution 2334. Since then, Israel has ignored and violated the resolution, just like every other resolution, persisting in its breaches of the Charter, of the most fundamental rules of international law, and of the determinations of the Council. Should the Security Council give in, surrender to Israel's colonial will, or should it deploy the necessary means to ensure respect for its resolutions and international law? I repeat, as I have said so many times before, you have the tools, you have the power, you have the mandate to enforce your resolutions and to enforce international law. Will you act on such basis, or will you continue to drag your feet and appease one country here and one country there? Let me say it again. Palestinians want to live, not merely to survive. They want to be safe in their homes. They want their children to go to school without fear. Palestinians want to be free in reality, as they are in spirit, free to live, to come and go, free to determine their own fate, subject only to God and to no other. They want to be Palestinians, to be themselves, just be, neither heroes nor victims, just human beings with the simplest of dreams or the greatest of aspirations, living in dignity, in peace and security in their own homeland. The Palestinian people is an extraordinary people whose true desire is to lead an ordinary life. They will settle for nothing less. Anybody expect them to accept their servitude, to coexist with their chains, is truly misguided. Freedom is their birthright. Freedom is their destiny. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. The world is experiencing a period of extraordinary instability. Yet, here we are, trapped in endless debates that miss the true heart of the issue. We gather here time and time again, like surgeons debating how to stitch a wound while the patient bleeds out before us. The longer this body remains blind to the reality, the greater the cost of the world will pay. Israel is not just fighting for itself, we are the front line in a battle that threatens the entire region and the world. We are standing firm, facing down the forces of the most oppressive regime in the world, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Council members, there is only one regime that openly, proudly, and consistently calls for the destruction of entire nations, the Islamic regime of Iran. You know, I look at you all. You are accustomed to debating conflicts across the world. And in every conflict, you identify its cause, whether it's a dispute over territory, or dispute over resources, or history between nations. Have you asked yourself, what is the conflict that the Iranian regime has with Israel? Why? There is no territorial dispute, as we separated by over 1,000 miles from Iran and Israel. No shared resources, and no violent history between us. The only reason is their fanatical ideology, festering hatred against the existence of our religion and state. Iran's grand ambition is the creation of a Shiite supremacist empire that stretches across the entire Middle East and beyond. They seek dominance, not diplomacy. They seek to impose their dark vision on the region, reshape the Middle East in their own image, and then extend their influence far beyond our borders. This Council and the world must wake up to the reality of the threat Iran poses. The dark force driving the violence we see today is not a collection of independent groups. It is Iran pulling the strings. Tehran proxies, Hezbollah in the north, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and terrorist cells in Judea and Samaria are all Iran's attack dogs, unleashed to spread death and destruction across the region. These proxies are the claws of a beast that is not content with attacking Israel alone, but is curving paths toward the domination of the Middle East. While Iran pulled the strings, the Palestinian Authority stand by, utterly weak and impotent. When they are not turning a blind eye due to their weakness, they are actively collaborating with these very terror networks. As I have reminded this Council many times, it has now been 348 days since the October 7 massacre, and yet the Palestinian Authority, including Mr. Riyad Mansour, still refuse to condemn Hamas. You know, we met here in this hall on Monday. I listened to your words, not one condemnation. We met in the General Assembly on Tuesday, nothing. Wednesday in the General Assembly, no one mentioned Hamas from the PA. Here we are again today, meeting here. Tomorrow we'll meet again at 3 p.m. Zero, nothing. We want to hear that, to see that there is a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And yet, neither you or President Abbas are capable of saying that. With leaders such as them, is it any wonder that terrorism continues to worsen in Judea and Samaria? The PA's failure to confront these threats head-on has only emboldened those who seek to spread terror in our region. With the Palestinian Authority failing to act and Iran's proxies continuing their relentless campaign, the threat to Israel's security grows more urgent by the day. On our northern border, Hezbollah, armed and funded by Iran, continues to launch rockets, drones, and missiles into Israel, with thousands of missiles poised to target our major civilian centers. In Gaza, Hamas weaponized an entire territory building the world's most extensive network of terror infrastructure. Now, Iran is attempting to replicate this strategy in Judea and Samaria. Consider what has been uncovered in recent months. Iran is flooding Judea and Samaria with explosives, grenades, anti-tank mines, and advanced weaponry, while recruiting terrorists to execute attacks against Israeli civilians. Iran's goal is to turn Judea and Samaria into another Gaza, a hotbed of terror that threatens to overflow into neighboring countries. The Iranian weapons, which are now flooding Judea and Samaria, are not improvised weapons. They are sophisticated munitions manufactured by Iran and deployed in Judea and Samaria for the sole purpose of murder. Earlier this year, Israeli forces exposed one of Iran's key operatives. His name is Munir Makada, who had been actively recruiting terrorists in Judea and Samaria. Makada had been orchestrating the smuggling of advanced Iranian weaponry, including anti-tank missiles and explosives, to carry out massive attacks on Israeli civilians. Thanks to the coordinated effort of our security and defense forces, an enormous stockpile of these weapons was seized, preventing another potential wave of terror. Enough weapons were recovered to equip a small army, an army funded and armed by Iran. Iran has transformed our region into its railway of terror. They are taking advantage of their grip, as you all know, over Syria and Lebanon, to deliver its advanced weapons to terrorists in Judea and Samaria. Iran's murderous Orient Express is operating right under the world's nose. As a result, and we heard the reports, as a result of these murderous efforts, our security forces have been forced to engage intensely. And it's true, we are engaging. Otherwise, our civilians would become the victims of Iran's terrorist mercenaries. These preventative measures in Judea and Samaria are not just an option, they are a necessity. While we have stopped many Iranian attempts to smuggle weaponry, we cannot stop them all. Just 2 weeks ago, Tel Aviv narrowly escaped a tragedy. A terrorist armed with a backpack full of explosives intended to enter a synagogue and murder the worshippers inside. But fate intervened, thanks God, and the suicide bomber exploded outside the synagogue before he carried out his plot. By nothing short of a miracle, countless innocent lives were spared. This was not an isolated moment, but a reminder of the dark web of terror Iran and its proxies continue to weave in Judea and Samaria. In the past 2 months alone, 2 car bombs were discovered and defused in Gush Etzion. A third one was planted along the path of a school bus filled with young children. These weren't distant threats or theories. They were immediate and deadly, stopped just moments before disaster. And then came the rocket fired from the heart of Jenin, which is a major city in northern Samaria, and exploding in a city nearby, Afula, among civilians. So rockets can fly not only from Gaza into Israel, but also from Judea and Samaria. A chilling demonstration of the terror that Iran and their proxies are determined to bring into our cities and into our very homes. This is why Israel must take preventative steps. We do not wait for disaster to strike before we act. Let me ask you all, what would your security forces do if they had intelligence about terrorists planning a massive attack on your civilian population? Think about your capital city. Would there be any doubt about what to do? Well, we have no such doubts, and neither do any of you. When a terrorist threat when a terrorist threat to the Taylor Swift concert in Austria was intercepted, the authorities canceled the show immediately, tracked down who was responsible, and arrested them. Afterwards, we were all relieved that a disaster was avoided. But when Israel takes the very same reasonable steps, we gather the intelligence, we neutralize the threat, preventive terror attacks against our civilians. What happened after? We are condemned. Colleagues, you have heard facts such as these before, but they bear repeating because this Council remains paralyzed by indecision. We are not dealing with isolated acts of terror. We are dealing with an orchestrated campaign of destruction directed by the Ayatollahs in Tehran. And while this body debates restraint and diplomacy, Iran's terror network grows stronger. The time for half measures, blind eyes, and empty statements is over. What is required now is not talk about the symptoms, but action against the disease itself, which is the Iranian regime. Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards must be designated as terrorist organizations worldwide. Sanctions against Iran must be intensified until the capacity to support terror is completely diminished. While we prevent their murderous aims before they take place, we expect this Council to stop them at the root. Israel will defend itself with all the force necessary to protect our people. We will dismantle every terrorist network, uproot every Iranian proxy, and strike down those who seek to harm us. The international community must stand with us, not just for Israel, but for the very future of the Middle East. The stakes could not be higher. The time for inaction has passed. Thank you.
Representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.